What is terrorism? Although words or definition may come to one's mind, things get complicated when you realize that there is no agreed-upon definition of terrorism. Countries and organizations all across the world have varying definitions. Defining it is subjective, as some require certain actions to be done and others argue that those actions don't define terrorism. What we do know is that for something to be a terrorist attack, it requires a political motive. But besides that, there is nothing else agreed upon. According to Sartori's ladder of generality, the more specific the parameters, the less cases fit under that definition. And this is something that holds true when it comes to this topic. Now, how do we go about defining terrorism? In the case of my project, I decided to break down the definition into 3 multiple choice parts: the elements of the action, the primary target, and the purpose of the action. Participants were given multiple options and asked to select one that best fits their personal definition of terrorism. 56.8% of respondents say that for something to be considered terrorism, there has to be some form of violence or attack, this being the most agreed upon thing out of every question. While many sources would agree with this, there are still few countries that would not. OECD countries such as Australia, Austria, and Switzerland classify that terrorism can be a threat or an act, which only 25% of participants stated. But France, the Netherlands, Spain, the United Kingdom, and the United States would agree with the 56.8% of respondents who stated a violent action or attack must occur for something to fall under terrorism. Another 13.6% stated that a threat and an attack are necessary for something to be considered terrorism. This would disqualify any acts that occur without a threat, following the ladder of generality by causing less cases to fall under this category. Now, let's look at how this would affect different popular media. In the hit show The Legend of Korra, a masked man who goes by the alias Amon decides he wants to rid the world of any benders, or people who can control the elements. He captures 3 benders, and at a rally he shares with his followers this belief and then proceeds to take away the ability of multiple benders. Those benders were never warned ahead of time before this happened. If we view this wanting to create equality by taking others' ability ways as a political motive, and we look at the fact that he started doing this without warning at first, with no attempt to peacefully talk with the benders, could we consider this an act of terrorism? The 56.8% of respondents who stated that there has to be some form of violence or attack, and the 25% who state that a threat or an attack had to occur what could convict him, but the 13.6% would struggle to do the same. They use the keyword "and," meaning that both actions would have to be involved to convict him, meaning all of his actions before he publicly threatened the benders would not be considered acts of terrorism. The same goes for the 2.3% who only stated a threat. We see a more uneven split on the topic of targets. 32.6% believe that the primary target of terrorist attacks are governments and citizens, whereas 27.9% believe that the primary targets are just citizens. We see 14% of participants selecting that the target was not in their definition, the largest number we've seen for this option yet. In that case, it seems that many people don't really look into the case of who is the target in terrorist actions, but focus more so on the actions themselves, which can go along with the other 4.7% who selected that there are no primary targets. We see a tie as 9.3% of participants selected citizens or governments, and another 9.3% only selected governments. The former of the two would have a lot more cases fitting their definitions, as it is a lot vaguer. And finally, 2.3% of participants believe that any non-military target is the primary target of terrorist attacks. Participants were given multiple options and combinations of options for the purposes of an act: coercion, harm/death, to spark fear, to politically persuade people of something, were 4 of the main options given. An option for a combination of these 4 was given, with 54.5% of participants choosing that option. It appears that many people view terrorism as an act with many reasons. The second most popular option was 27.3% of participants selecting it was to spark fear. As we know, the word terror is in terrorism, making it not surprising that this option was so popular. The interesting third choice, with 11.4% of participants selecting, was the option for coercion or harm, or to spark fear, or to politically persuade people. This option is interesting because participants selecting it have chosen an option with lots of "or" statements. As we know, "or" versus "and" makes a mountain of a difference in a definition for terrorism. Participants who selected this option see that any attack with any of these 4 motives are considered a terrorist attack. If they follow the other guidelines, of course, while the 54.5% believe there must be some combination of these 4 for something to be a terrorist attack. This means, according to the latter, the 11.4% will have a much broader definition, where many more cases can fit into it, whereas the 54.5% have a slightly more specific definition. The 11.4% who chose to spark fear as a motive and the 4.5% who chose harm/death as a motive have an even smaller amount of cases fit into it. For example, in the 2014 thriller Terror in Residence, characters often do actions to mess with investigators, including taunting videos. But the terrorists in this case are careful to not cause harm. They cause blackouts, making sure to evacuate the building before bombing them, etc. How would these animated terrorists fit into our definitions? They certainly wouldn't fit into the definition of the 4.5% who chose harm/death to be the primary motive, but they would agree with the 11.4% as this could be something viewed to cause fear. Would their actions line up with the 54.5% though? We know that their actions cause fear, but not death/harm. But do their actions try to politically persuade others? Is coercion a motive? Deciding the answer to those two questions would be needed to define their actions as terrorism, according to the 54.5% of participants. When asking participants to list one or two words that come to mind when thinking of terrorism, the 44 participants listed 76 different words they associate. Of these 76 responses, we have 39 distinct words. We find that the most common word is a combination of bomb, bombing, and bomber, totaling 9 responses, not including suicide bomber, which counted as a different word for being so specific. Next, we have violence and 9/11 tied with 7 mentions each. I believe this is important to note as 9/11 was such a big tragedy in the United States, and as far as I'm aware, this quiz was only taken in the United States, and if not, then at least a majority of it was. This will come into play later. The rest of the terms range from 5 to 1 mentions, and when we combine all this into a pie chart, we get this messy and confusing looking circle. While this circle can be helpful, there are ways to make it even more beneficial for our purposes, by creating words into broader categories to see what most of the words are discussing. To do this, I created 10 broad categories: harm, creating 36% of the mentions, explosion-related, being 17.3%, reasons being 12%, specific event being 9.3%, specific group being 6.7%, feelings about the event being 5.3%, describing people in the non-specific group/multiple group category both tying for 4%, and countries with a mere 2.7% of mentions. This gives us a much bigger idea of what people associate with the word terrorism, usually thinking about the harm that comes with it or the explosive means it can occur. Now, before asking for words people associate with terrorism, I asked participants to write their own definition of terrorism. Using the knowledge of our last response, I could see how many of these words were used in the actual definitions provided. Our list immediately narrows from the original 76 words to only 15. These words include violence, horrible becoming horror, fear, attack, arguing, religion, hurt, threat/threatening, pain, terror, USA becoming America, causality becoming cause, harm, and weapons. But there are other important terms to look for. 4 people mentioned the government in their definitions, but only 1 mentioned citizens. 9 participants mentioned groups, but only 4 mentioned individuals. Another 3 respondents mentioned targeted, and 29 used the word act or action in the definition, rather than referring to the event only as an attack or something of the sort. Another interesting way to think about terrorism is to think about what is or isn't classified as a terrorist event. Participants were asked to agree or disagree with the statement being, the event at the Capitol on January 6th was an act of terrorism. Of this, we could find that a majority of participants believe it was, with 72.7% of participants ranging their answers from strongly agree to slightly agree. On the other hand, we only have 15.9% of participants ranging from slightly disagree to disagree. This contrast is important to note, as not only is the amount of disagreements much lower, but there is no one who strongly disagrees with the statement, whereas 12 participants strongly agree with the statement. Now, how do we know which side is right? Well, we don't. Because there are so many definitions of terrorism, we find that there can be reason for both answers. What we do know for sure, though, is that terrorism requires a political motive, which this event definitely had. The rest of deciding whether or not this event qualifies as terrorism depends on the individual's view. Some people might believe that the group must have the intention of causing death, or that death must occur for something to be considered a terrorist attack, and hence decides it does not qualify, while others might believe something else. Participants were asked to select what they believe are the 3 most likely reasons a group would commit an act of terrorism, with an option to add their own thinking if wanted. Of this, 75% of participants identified political motives as being part of the top 3. This is a great number to see, as a political motive is required for something to qualify as a terrorist action. After that, we see 56.8% of participants selecting religious motives and also selecting hatred toward a specific group of people. Both of these are interesting because there are so many attacks without these motives, but we should also look into how news on this topic is portrayed online. It's no secret that people take any chance to condemn people with different beliefs, especially when someone with a different belief does something we view negatively. For example, there was a large increase of hatred towards Muslims after 9/11, and we live in an increasingly hateful world. In 2000, the FBI's Uniform Crime Report states that there were 28 recorded anti-Islamic instances. In 2001, we see 481 instances. Keep in mind that 9/11 was in September, meaning that most of this increase in incidents happened between a 4-month span. Now, this is possibly a reason so many people may believe religion to be a reason a group would commit an act of terrorism, because people are so easy to assume they are doing it because they have a different belief that is not their own. As far as hatred towards a specific group of people, I think we see this answer as popular as it is because we are now in an age of technology. We are constantly hearing about hatred in the world towards others for aspects they cannot control, and this is important to note that in the US alone we have a wide variety of known hate groups. Because of this, it is possible that many consider these hate groups to be terrorist organizations, and that is the reason they believe this is such a popular motive. We then have ideological motives in fourth with 43.2% of participants, and in fifth, we have to show power with 31.8% of participants. Besides that, everything remains relatively low, with oil/natural resourcing having 0%. It is important to note that when we are conducting the survey, general demographic questions were asked in the beginning. It is important to note that unfortunately my survey has a great bias towards college freshmen, as 68.2% of participants responded that they were a freshman in college. Whether or not their opinions will change later on, I cannot tell you, as this survey was not designed to find that out, but it is possible that this could have had an effect on the responses received. The survey did bring back very similar numbers for most of the colleges on campus though. Another interesting thing to look into is how participants specifically viewed this in an American lens. Recalling the question where participants were asked to list a few words they associate with terrorism, we can remember that 7 participants mentioned 9/11. This is reasonable as it was a big event that affected people living in America personally. It's something that we all grew up learning about and something that people that responded might even remember. But it gets a little more interesting when we look into things related to that. Participant number 15 specifically mentioned America in this section. While it's not too odd since they were also one of the 7 to mention 9/11, it's interesting that they were only focused on attacks in America. They were also the only participants to add a motive under the question asking to pick 3, writing about colonialism. But the American lens isn't only observed through them, and they are only a mild case of that. Participant number 28, on the other hand, defined terrorism as attacking American safety. This is an odd response as it only views terrorism as something related to America, where we know terrorism occurs all over the world and many more countries are affected by it. With a definition such as this, participant 28 can get almost anyone in the country convicted on charges of terrorism. Overall, if I was to redo this assignment, there would be a few things I would change. Number 1, the number of participants. Ideally, I would love to get more data than what I had, and there are a few different ways I could do this. I could try an incentive, but since this is my own project and not sponsored by the university, I would have to pay for it myself. An incentive could also change who participates, as something might attract certain people to participate but drive others away. An incentive would also require people to leave some form of contact, and the lack of anonymity might discourage certain people from participating. Realistically, if I was to do an incentive, I would probably make a section to add contact information if one wanted the chance to win it. Another strategy would be to reach out to schools and ask people in charge to send out the survey. The cons of this is that it's a lot more time consuming than the deadline allowed. In an attempt to reach out to my former high school about the survey, I was told I would need to contact the superintendent to get permission. There are possibly other ways I can do this though. Perhaps I could join clubs and send them to group chats. Many campuses organize clubs via the app Discord, such as UMass Dartmouth. I was able to send these forms to multiple clubs, but many schools require your school email to confirm who you are, meaning that one cannot necessarily join other schools' clubs. Unfortunately, this eliminates a possible option for me. Number 2, questions. Based off what I found, I could add in more questions asking about different things. After I had already made my form, I learned that 2 of my friends thought that ISIS was behind 9/11 rather than Al-Qaeda, and that other friends had no idea who was behind 9/11. I think that this can honestly be an interesting question to ask, although I have no idea how the results of this would look. Another interesting question could have been about the different methods groups use to conduct a violent attack, perhaps asking the most common method or something along those lines. I say this as a common association with the word terrorism was related to bombs, and it could be interesting to look more into that aspect. I could also ask about what countries people feel are committing the most terrorist acts, or who's receiving the most terrorist acts, as I feel that is something that not everyone is super educated on. I could also ask what countries are considered state sponsors of terrorism, the answers being Cuba, Iran, Syria, and North Korea. as this is something many people may not be educated on either. Overall, this was a very interesting assignment, but with a larger number of participants, more times, and new methods and questions, it could be improved. I feel as though the project demonstrates how we tend to view terrorism through an American lens and proves the point that defining terrorism is hard, as it is not something our participants could agree on.